Rivers APC suspends chairman, seeks probe of Amechi over anti-party activities. Police invite Tonya Cole over murder allegations. Police seal Plateau Assembly complex over speakership tussle. And outside of Nigeria, South Africa revokes national state of disaster. And in East Africa, Raila Odinga calls for talks to involve parties outside parliament. Conversations and controversies continue in the aftermath of Nigeria's general elections. Tonight, we look at accusations of treason against the presidential candidate and renewed focus on the Independent National Electoral Commission's conduct of the presidential elections after comments from a federal minister. My guests tonight are Jide Ologun, legal practitioner and public affairs analyst, and Deji Ajare, executive director at the Sterling Law Center. This is Politics HQ. I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun. Welcome to the show. Nigerians are still dissecting and digesting the events of the presidential elections. Opposition parties have taken their challenges of the results to court. But while Africa's largest economy and most populous black country awaits the results of various petitions, conversations have been varied, with the Department of State Services telling Nigerians some days ago that it has credible evidence of people working to bring about an interim government in Nigeria. There have been protests for and against not just the conduct of the elections, but also the eventual results. This weekend, an audio of a conversation supposedly between the Labour Party's presidential candidate Peter Obi and a religious leader in Nigeria was released. Catch Ononoju, special advisor on public affairs to the Labour Party presidential candidate, denied that the audio was real and said that it was a deep fake meant to distract the party from pursuing its case in the courts. But the conversation around the contestation of results has taken a new turn after Nigeria's Minister of Information and Communication, Lai Mohammed, warned Peter Obi against inciting violence over the outcome of the presidential election. He accused Obi and his running mate, Datti Baba Ahmed, of treason and insurrection. Peter Obi has responded, describing the allegations as malicious and fictitious. Joining me right now is Jide Ologun, legal practitioner and public affairs analyst, and we hope that our second guest will also be able to join us in the course of the show. Mr. Ologun, welcome to Politics HQ. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you also.
So let's start with these heavy words that we are hearing from the Minister of Information and Communication: treason and insurrection. Those are not words that should be thrown away or thrown around very carelessly. We've seen tensions rise in the past few weeks since the presidential elections. Let's start with an idea of the sentiment and the atmosphere. Are you surprised that we've gotten to this point where treason is being mentioned, where we're hearing from the DSS that it has credible claims of people planning to impose an interim government on Nigerians?
When you take treason as the word, it means the crime of attacking a state authority to which you owe your allegiance, or supporting the enemy of the state against the state. And what is being claimed here by the minister on behalf of the Federal Republic of Nigeria is that the utterances of the Labour Party vice presidential candidate at the last poll, that, saying that the Supreme Court must probably dance to their own tunes, and that the president-elect, they should not be sworn into office, when by virtue of the Constitution, INEC is the umpire mandated to manage the elections of the country. And there is a provision in the ecosystem of our electioneering processes that if you are not satisfied with the final verdict of INEC, then go to court. So these statements have been perceived by the state as trying to incite the people against the state and dictate to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land since 1963. So I think this is where we are coming from. And like I said, it's a very serious crime. But at this point in time, they may just be mere allegations. And that is why Peter Obi has responded that there is a need to substantiate this allegation. But I can let you know that for those who are in the camp of Peter Obi, We need to understudy the government very well and try to realize that the government also has a responsibility to prevent the nation from going into chaos. And that is why one of the comments of the minister, Lai Mohammed, is that if you have submitted your party's interest to the judicial process through the election tribunal, then why are you making all these comments again? Because that provision is there. And in the case of insurrection, like inciting the people against the state, and of course, the state needs to be proactive in ensuring that we don't have that crisis in our hands. And if you link the statement that was made on media platform, and that platform had been sanctioned, and you combine it with the leaked conversation between Peter Obi and one of the prominent clerics in the nation, then you realize that there may be a need for caution in how some of the candidates are going about seeking justice in court in respect of the last election. And don't forget also that at a point in time, even a chieftain of APC came out to insinuate that some may be, gunning towards planning a coup, whatever, and he was invited by DSS. And lately, DSS has cautioned those who are trying to put in place an interim government. So this is a very sensitive time for Nigeria now. And the advice we can just give is that if there is a judicial process that has been incorporated into the electioneering ecosystem, let's submit to it and be careful about the statements that we make. Because when you talk about treason, anyone who has committed treason is known in law as a traitor. And I don't think any of the candidates during the last general elections will want to be treated as a traitor.
Okay.
And those are my intentions at this point.
So your opening comments are well noted, and just, of course, for the conversation, we did speak to a representative of the Labour Party and Peter Obi, and they've denied that that audio is a real audio, saying that it's a deep fake meant to distract not just the party, but also Nigerians. So also joining me now, Deji Ajare. He's the Executive Director of the Sterling Law Center. Mr. Ajare, welcome to the show. Laying an opening foundation around this conversation happening now around treason, I want to look specifically at what Lai Mohammed is quoted as saying. And he apparently is on a tour in the United States, has met media organizations, and he's quoted as saying this: Obi and his vice, Datti Ahmed, cannot be threatening Nigerians that if the president-elect, Bola Tinubu of the All Progressives Congress, is sworn in on May 29th, it will be the end of democracy in Nigeria. This is treason. You cannot be inviting insurrection, and this is what they're doing. Obi's statement is that of a desperate person. He is not the Democrat that he claimed to be. A Democrat should not believe in democracy only when he wins, end quote. So if we start with just the beginning of that statement, where he talks about Obi and his vice threatening Nigerians that if the president-elect is sworn in, then that means the end of democracy. When you look at that statement on its own, do you think that statement meets up to the standards of being considered a treasonable statement, a statement that is looking to incite people to insurrection?
Thank you so much for having me. Good evening again. I'll be very, very honest with you, I have tried to over and over listen to the video that that the minister referenced, where the vice presidential candidate of the Labour Party in the last election said if His Excellency Alhaji Bola Tinubu is sworn in on May 29th, would be the end of democracy or the death of democracy. And matter of fact is, I am able to agree that it is a treasonable statement. Look, it is elections, it is politics, and it is not unusual for politicians to use rhetoric and propaganda during elections. In fact, it is quite common for politicians to use such strong, emotional, and persuasive languages to appeal to gain support from the electorates, from the citizenry. And these techniques sometimes includes exaggerations, name calling, appeals to fear or to patriotism sometimes. But politicians have been known to use these tactics for centuries as a way to manipulate public opinion and win elections. Of course, it is for the voters to demonstrate strong awareness of these tactics and carefully evaluate the information they are presented in order to make informed decisions. But treason is an act of betraying one's country or government, so typically by intentionally collaborating with an enemy during a time of war or engaging in acts that aim to overthrow or undermine the government. Of course, it is a serious offense, and I don't think the statements that were attributed to Datti really should be regarded as treasonable statements in that context. It was, to the best of my knowledge, such statements have been made even by some of the members of the APC who are currently in government in the periods preceding the 2015 elections, and even thereafter, there were quite a lot of statements that were even more incendiary in nature than the statements that is. I think perhaps the propaganda is just coming from both sides, both on the part of the Labour Party, and the APC is probably just capitalizing on that statement to, probably prepare grounds for, some sort of suppression. In my opinion, that's what it looks like.
Okay, so Mr. Ologun, I want to go back to something you said, and that was around the Supreme Court. We've been following, I guess we'd say, protests and rallies. Let's use the languages now. Protests and rallies for and against the election results, some supporting INEC, some not supporting INEC. But interestingly enough, there are some of the protesters who have said that there are attempts to intimidate the Supreme Court of Nigeria when it comes to possibly having one of the petitions reach all the way up to the Supreme Court. Do you think it's even possible to intimidate the Supreme Court? Because again, both of you have mentioned issues around rhetoric and the language used by not now just politicians, but those who've inserted themselves into the ongoing controversies around the elections. Is it even possible to really intimidate the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land for Nigeria?
The Supreme Court, I know, cannot be intimidated, and that is a fact. It's been the highest court in the land since 1963. And let's use the very recent case we have in the country, talking about the Naira swap, the reduction of the Naira, when the state went to Supreme Court as the court of first and final jurisdiction on matters between states and the Federation. And several arguments came that could have intimidated the Supreme Court that, CBN is not a party to the case, your decision cannot be binding on central bank. But the 7-man panel said, this is our position, let these old currencies return to circulation. And when the president weighed the decision, as against his earlier absorption of office by saying only 200 Naira should return to circulation, he had to throw in the towel. And of course, he pushed it to the Attorney General and the governor of Central Bank that he has not at any point in time instructed them to disobey the decision of the Supreme Court. And by the way, when you start your case at the election tribunal, if you are not satisfied with the decision there, you proceed to the appellate level, the appeal court. And if you are not satisfied, you proceed to the Supreme Court. And we have the instant case of Osun State now. The tribunal took a decision, though not unanimous, that the victory of Adeleke be upturned. And the matter proceeded to Court of Appeal, and Court of Appeal said no, that it should be confirmed as the governor-elect. And we are now waiting to see if the former governor will proceed to the Supreme Court or not. So I do not see the Supreme Court being intimidated in this matter. I've always said this, but it may not go down with many, that it's all about how you present your case. And that is the power of litigation. You don't expect that somebody should come and prove your case for you. And that is why when you talk about the criminal justice value chain, you talk about 3 important pillars, which is number 1, thorough investigation, number 2, diligent prosecution, and number 3, a committed judiciary. And I've heard several say that the judiciary cannot be trusted. I don't want to key into that template. You see, what we can all do is to ensure that if we have laid down grievance procedures, let's respect it. And like my colleague rightly mentioned here, all these political parties should realize that there are procedures. They all signed to the peace accord before these elections. And election presupposes that somebody will win. And that's one of the points that the state is clearly rolling out now, that please, you need to, when you signing the peace accord, was it that if I don't win, then heaven should be let loose? And this is the democratic aspect of the whole process. So I do not see the judiciary being intimidated. And that is, of course, why you have the 3 levels of interventions, particularly in case of this presidential election and governorship election, that if you are not satisfied with the decision of the tribunal, you proceed to the Court of Appeal, and if you are not satisfied, you go to the Supreme Court. And after the Supreme Court, that is the final point of verdict. And let me also say this, that, talking about interpreting statements, and it's at the discretion of the state. It is what, and if you go down history, many people have been apprehended. Some of the statements of some Nigerians that some people never thought could lead them to where they are today were taken as light statements. And what we are asking for is that, please, as we approach elections, even when we are not satisfied with the outcome or the processes, let us engage the legitimate channels that have been put in place. Because when you talk about inciting the people, how are you going to control the people? You can see what is going on in the USA now. The former president of America, Donald Trump, is being arraigned in New York City. At a time during the last elections, he incited the people to, roll out an attack on the Capitol, and the system frowned so much on it. So we need to be proactive. Yeah, majority are in the school of thought that there were many complaints about these last elections. But cutting off the head is not the solution to headache. And that's why we are also appealing generally that we should please engage these issues in very proactive manner and, of course, peaceful manner. And those are my submissions for now. But I said it somewhere also, if parties do not approach the judiciary will not impose anything on anybody. If the state governors did not go to Supreme Court in respect of the Naira swap case, Supreme Court would have been watching. Well, they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court intervened, and we can see now that the hardship unleashed on the citizens are easing out because of that judicial intervention. And that is why we have the 3 arms of government, talking about the legislative arms, judiciary, and the executive.
All right.
Exactly. So that we have separations of power, and we have a symbiotic relationship to ensure good governance in the land.
And checks and balances. Okay, Mr. Ajare, I want to come to you now, because this statement about treason, or this accusation of treason, is actually being made by the Minister of Information and Communication, Lai Mohammed. But there's also been a conversation around whether or not Lai Mohammed equals the federal government. Does he equal the stance of the Buhari administration on this issue? Is Lai Mohammed saying this equal to us having the Buhari administration saying that they believe that Peter Obi is towing the line of treason? What do you think?
Alhaji Lai Mohammed is the Minister of Information. Presumably, he is the mouthpiece of the federal government, as it is. And so, it's presumably, when he speaks for the federal government. Of course, if it is not so, one would expect him to specifically identify that this, whatever it is he is saying, or whatever statements or position he's taken, and not that of the federal government, but that of himself in his personal capacity. But I think I'm very glad, that we are introducing variations of these things. And I would rather want to look at the statement credited to Datti more as incitement, and not less of treason and more of an incitement. And so, if at all, the government, the federal government, is interested in not taken any steps to stop such inflammatory and incendiary statements. Yes, they should address, the choice of words are very, very, very important here, especially given the circumstance, the context in which these issues are coming up, the politics of it, the complaints, the feeling that some people have that they've been rigged out of the election. It's important. So you don't put treason where you should put incitement, and there are two different offenses. You check our law books, you'll find that, look, the definition of those offenses are separate and different. The punishments meted out for the two offenses are also separate and different. And so, for me, when Alhaji Mohammed speaks, he should speak with some sort of introspection as a minister, one of the Federal Republic, and then as a mouthpiece of the federal government, particularly when he's speaking at on an international platform. It's important that the government does not also lend itself to suggestions of unfairness. So, for me, well, if the President of the Federal Republic has not come out specifically to also say, no, this is not our position on this issue, then of course it is the federal government's position. And while I agree with my learned colleagues that it is the prerogative of the state to determine what is treasonable or what is inciting. But then again, he has also gone ahead to also tell us, you see, it is not for the executive to sit down in judgment, as the accuser and the prosecution, and then as the judge. So if indeed there are any crimes that have been committed or offenses that have been committed, then of course the appropriate things that ought to be done should be done. But then we should also be careful that we don't also concede too much of these powers to the state. Otherwise, we will inadvertently be ceding other rights to them. The right to freedom of expression is a very important right for democratic experience. And so when there is too much, there is excessive monitoring and of
oversight,
speeches, it becomes at the end of the day, or actually now breaches other rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. I am not saying that the right to freedom of speech and expression are absolute, but I am saying it is important that we're careful in conceding the right to this, to the right to eventually look into everything that we say, and also and then start dishing out the punishments for media houses too, because at the end of the day, they play a very important role in stabilizing our democracy, but informing the people, the citizenry, and in conscientizing them. And so if the media starts working under an atmosphere of fear, of intimidation,
self-censorship,
you know that we are in trouble. Democracy will definitely start to falter.
Okay, so I want to take both of you up on something you've said, because you've sort of taken me into my next question, which is why when I heard Mr. Ologun talk about the discretion of the states when it comes to the issue of terrorism, and you yourself, Mr. Ajare, have talked about it being the prerogative of the state, I would have to ask you, where does the burden to prove not terrorism, I beg your pardon, where does the burden to prove treason lie? Because at this point in time, it sounds like someone has shouted fire in a very crowded space. Mr. Ologun, you made mention of the situation in the U.S. currently. Donald Trump being charged with some 34 counts felonies right now. This is stemming partly, not necessarily, the case is involving a former porn star, but it also has some of the elements around the conversation around the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And you said very firmly that the U.S. has frowned on that. It's trying to secure its democracy in the way it knows how. But we have a minister accusing someone of treason. We don't know if there's going to be a case to follow that up. And it just seems to be hanging in the air. It's an accusation no one, whether presidential candidates or even just an ordinary Nigerian, would want to have around their neck. So when it comes to this burden of proving treason, this burden or discretion or prerogative, what do we say about that? How do we leave this hanging in the air if the federal government is not going to take it any further? should we be expecting, with an accusation such as this, that there should be a furtherance of it, not just something you accuse someone of and leave it in the air? Mr. Ajare, let me start with you.
Well, but it is the law is the position of the law is that he who asserts must prove, and if the federal government is the one alleging that the statements made by Mr. Datti are treasonable, and it is up to the government, the state, to prove that those statements are indeed treasonable, and they can only do so before a properly constituted court of law. Now, the concern one would have, because of the political nature and because of our experiences as a country, really, is that these kind of circumstances, these kind of situations can be leveraged on by politicians to punish or silence their opponents. And it is the reason why it is really important that we as citizens are very, very watchful, very, very careful in following the issues as they arise, and where it is necessary, we must call our government to do what is necessary, because it is common knowledge that governments, including the current one, they've been using the law enforcement instruments of the law enforcement to stifle public conversation, to stifle opposition. We all recall just last year or 2 years ago when the federal government banned Twitter simply because a statement made by the president was flagged by the operators of Twitter. And of course, thankfully, that was the ECOWAS court was eventually condemned, and the government was asked to make a commitment to non-reoccurrence of such. But you see, that is just even a very simple, because at the end of the day, we could say, oh, nobody was really caught, but people were caught. But there are cases where people have been hounded, people have been disappeared. And so it will give me, on a personal note, and I think a lot of Nigerians, concerns. And so we would want to be very, very vigilant on this kind of issue.
So we're going to take that break right now. When we come back, wrapping up this aspect of the conversation, but then also looking at another part of the controversy that has stemmed from Minister Lai Mohammed's comments while he's in the United States. And that has to do with the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC's iRev server, and the uploading or lack thereof of the presidential results. That conversation will continue after this.